Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mangus, and today it is a very special day in the Fire Emblem community because today it is the birthday of my favorite Fire Emblem game in the franchise, Fire Emblem 6 The Binding Blade. 18 years ago this game came out in Japan, so if this game was a person, it would be old enough to drink right now in some countries, which is kind of interesting to think about. And I'm a little bit salty because my birthday was yesterday, and I just realized that if I had just been born one day later, I would have shared a birthday with my favorite game. So yeah, I gotta go blame my parents for that one, I suppose. So yeah, today I wanted to make a video in honor of Fire Emblem 6, and I figured, you know what? A lot of people wonder why this is my favorite game in the franchise. I think I've explained it here and there in some videos over the years, but I've never made a video where I just sit down and I explain the reasons why I love this game. I realize it's not everyone's favorite game. A lot of people look at the game and they don't necessarily outright hate it, but they look at it and they go like, yeah, you know, it's a cool game, Roy's a cool lord and all that, and I like a lot of things about it, but there's some aspects to it that are kind of tedious, and I don't really like it for that reason. And, you know, I just wanted to explain, like, why is this game such a favorite for me? Obviously, there's a lot of nostalgia attached to it, and if you go watch one of the videos I made a long time ago called My Story in Fire Emblem, I explain in that video that, you know, the circumstances around which I played Fire Emblem 6 kind of impacted how I felt about the game, but there is more to it. It's not just nostalgia and good memories for me. There are legit reasons as to why I really enjoy this game every time I play it. Not just, you know, rose-tinted glasses and it brings back good memories. There's also some mechanical decisions in this game that, in my opinion, gets underrated a lot, and a lot of people tend to focus on the negatives, which completely outweighs the positives. But I realize that not everyone thinks like me, so that's why I'm making this video, to explain to you guys the 10 reasons why I love Fire Emblem 6 The Binding Blade. Let's begin. 1. The story focuses on the world, not the characters. So one thing that FE6 gets frequently criticized for is having a bit of a bland story. And I think this is in part because Roy is kind of a boring protagonist, and he totally is. There is not much positive to say about Roy. He's a good design and cool promotion, and that's pretty much about it. He doesn't really say or do anything spectacular in the game that makes you go, whoa. I think the original old translation patch that a lot of people played back in the day did him a bit of a disservice because he was portrayed very plainly in that. He's a little bit better in the new translation patch, and I do believe a little bit better still in his original Japanese script, but I'm not gonna, like, that's not my hill to die on. I'm not gonna argue that Roy's an interesting character because he's not. And compared to games like FE7, where you have the three main lords, Eliwood, Lyn, and Hector, and their interactions with each other, Roy's interactions with Merlinus seem kind of tame in comparison. They're not particularly interesting. However, what FE6 does better than a lot of the other games in the franchise, in my opinion, is building its world. Now, most people get attached to characters and character-driven stories. I'm a little bit the other way around. I get attached to good world building. I read a lot of books. I read like maybe a book every week, and I'm really into fiction where the world is properly structured. That is the kind of stuff that gets me really invested in a story. When the author goes into great detail describing the origins of each continent with like a mythology and a history, like a deep, rich history, and I really get the sense that FE6 pulls this off pretty well. You know, Alib is very well structured. And when you go around on the different continents, there's always some sort of information about the history of the continent, why it was founded, what people live there, what they work like, and what they live by, and like how they get by. You know, do they have a trade? Do they mine? Do they, you know, what are the people's purpose for living in this continent? And stuff like that, I think, is really important to forming a world. You know, who are these people? Why did they settle there? Why are they here? What is their relationship to these other countries around them? And, you know, I really think that there's a lot of depth to the conflicts in FE6. You know, how Etruria colonizes the Western Isles and exploits the people there. You know, the relationship between Sake and Byrne. You know, Illa's place in the world. There's a lot of really cool relations there. A lot of politics, a lot of scheming. But mostly when you're on screen, you see Merlinus reporting to Roy, and it's not super exciting, and a lot of people tune out as a result, I think. But if you really get invested into the world building of FE6, there's a lot of stuff going on there. Every time you go and pick up a legendary weapon, Elfin shows up and he gives a bit of a exposition about the weapon and why it's there and who wielded it, which I think is really cool. And yeah, just a lot of really cool stuff about FE6, which I feel get overlooked because the characters on screen aren't necessarily super interesting. But in my opinion, if the world building is good, the characters don't really need to be super exciting. It's kind of like the relationship I have with FE4 and Sigurd. Sigurd's kind of a boring character, but the story he's in is so good that you can't help but be attached and endeared by him. And I have the same relationship with FE6. Again, I don't have the same relationship with Roy, obviously, because he's kind of a template, but I do really love the world of Alib and how it's structured in that game. And I think that this is a very underappreciated aspect of FE6 that a lot of people tend to overlook. Number 2, the game feels like a journey. So this ties a little bit into my first point about world building. Fire Emblem 6, from start to finish, is an epic experience. It takes a long time to play this game. Not only are there a lot of chapters, but the maps are pretty big. So when you sit down and you want to play through FE6, well, you better set off a lot of time. Now, for some people, this may not be a good thing, but to me, I think it really enhances the experience. Not only does it take a long time to beat this game, but you also travel across the entire continent. There's not that many other Fire Emblem games where you do that. There's usually some continents you don't even visit on the map. You start out in Lycia and you go to Ostia, and then you travel to the Western Isles, then all the way down to the Nabata Desert, then you go to the other side of the map, and you go to either Sakai or Ilia, depending on your route split, and then you end up in Bern, and then you go to the Dragon Temple. And it really, like, towards the end of it, you really feel like you have been on a journey with Roy and his friends, and it's just every time I beat Binding Blade, I'm baffled by how long the game is, you know. In comparison, whenever I play, like, Fire Emblem 8 to Sacred Stones, I'm always, like, shocked, like, wow, I'm at the end game already. This game is, like, really short. And again, some people may not like the fact that the game is long, but for me, it means that I'm gonna connect a lot with the characters that I use, because I'm gonna be with them for a very long time, you know? If you use a character from the start of that game, you're gonna be stuck with that character for a very long while. You're gonna see them grow from a little level 1 scrub to like a super busted promoted unit in the late game, and yeah, I think this game is really epic in that regard. It really feels like you're on a long journey from start to finish, and that is really cool. Number 3. Binding Blade feels like a war rather than a skirmish. This is something I always feel whenever I play one of the smaller games or the smaller scope games like FE7, where you're practically playing as a group of mercenaries and knights fighting against an assassin's guild. It's not as epic in my opinion. I was always a big fan of the games where you really go out and fight a war, like in Fire Emblem 4 where units move in formation and there's like these huge armies on each side. I really like it when there's a war, and FE6, while it does start off as a little bit of a skirmish, like Roy and a few knights against some bandits, it evolves into like a full-scale warfare scenario, and it really peaks at chapter 21, where you go up against the Grand Army of Bern, and they are just sending like hundreds of Wyvern Lords your way, and you have a big army too, and it's just a massacre where the plains run red with blood, and it really is epic. Roy, while I do not necessarily buy that he's like a war commander, I don't really see him in that role at all, it does feel like he's actually leading an army, not just a band of skirmishers, and most of the battles, they do feel like real epic historical battles. And for me, that adds a lot, because for me, Fire Emblem will always be about large-scale battles. I'm not a big fan of the small skirmishes. I never was. There's some merit in that, but for me, I want to see huge armies clash on the battlefield. I want to see kings go to war with each other, with knights and generals and battlefield tactics. That is what really gets my blood pumping, and that is why I love Binding Blade. Number 4. Hard mode is a very solid challenge, without being unfair. So now we're moving a little bit over to gameplay. I really like the difficulty in FE6. I feel like it is one of the harder games in the series that you can undertake. Well, at the same time, it's not quite like unfair, similar to Awakening Lunatic or Lunatic Plus. I feel like FE6 hard mode is very beatable if you know how to play, and it's not too RNG dependent. It's a little bit RNG dependent in the start, certainly not perfect, but I personally like how you can't just send one strong unit into just solo enemies, not at least for quite some time. You do get some powerhouses later on, like Percival, who can do that, but at least in the early to mid game, you really have to gang up on enemies to take them down. The enemies aren't necessarily like, they're not gonna one round you most of the time unless you send a really weak character into a very strong enemy, but you really need to gang up in the early game. Like 3 or 4 characters need to work together to take down a single enemy, and most of the time you are outnumbered, which means you have to really position yourself wisely and use every little advantage you can to get the edge on your enemies. Enemies have a lot of HP, they're very tough to take down, the bosses are very hard, they're on gates with a ton of defense, and in this scenario, you really notice which of your units are good and which of your units are bad. And that's another point I'll get to later, the difference between power level of the characters. But hard mode, it always gets my blood pumping every time I play it. No matter how experienced I get at this game, hard mode will always challenge me, while at the same time, it very seldom frustrates me. Like, there are some cases, of course, where, you know, you feel like the RN is a little bit unfair, you know, you have those 60 to 70% hits that you miss occasionally, which is part of the Binding Blade experience, and I get that that's frustrating to some people, but in my opinion, there are always ways to work around that, to ensure that the RN is not going to screw you over too much. But of course, there's always that little uncertainty when it comes to hard mode. But I think that hard mode is really fun, really enjoyable, and I personally think it's a good difficulty. Now, I definitely see why a lot of people will disagree with me on this. A lot of people really despise hard mode on Binding Blade, and that's completely fine. Not everyone plays the game like I do, but I think once you really put yourself into the game and you realize how to utilize your characters in the early game, what stat boosters to give them, what units to train, what equipment to give them, where to place them, who to field, you can really get through it pretty easily. I mean, Chapter 7 is one of the notoriously hardest chapters, not only in Fire Emblem 6, but I think in the entire game. And I used to struggle like crazy with that. I made a fail montage of it way back in 2011 when I played it, where I just failed and failed and failed and failed and failed. But now I am pretty much able to go and play it perfectly every time. So there is a lot of skill involved in FE6 and tackling its hard mode, and I think it's a lot of fun to do. Number 5, units are not balanced. Some are better than others. Now, why on earth am I listing this as a good thing? The most common complaint I see when people play FE6 is that so many characters in that game seems like a waste of space. They're just bad characters. Characters like Boris, Wendy, and Barth. Some characters like Trek that people don't like, even though I think he's actually pretty good. You know, there's just a lot of characters. Waltz, Dorothy. I mean, some people don't like Gonzalez, even though I think he's kind of underrated. A lot of people play this game and they're like, oh my god, why can't every character be good? Like, why even have them there if they're going to be so bad? Because I don't want to use them. Now, yeah, I do agree that there are some issues with a lot of the FE6 characters being sort of bad units, and especially on hard mode, they really fall off. But I think that having different power levels among units is a lost art in FE6, and allow me to explain why. So if you pick up any of the modern Fire Emblem games, there's very few units in modern Fire Emblem, and I consider modern Fire Emblem like Awakening and beyond, even though Awakening is pretty old at this point. I do consider that sort of like the modern era of Fire Emblem. There are very few games that have bad characters. There are some characters in the modern Fire Emblem games who are considered bad. I think in Tree Houses, a lot of people think that Cyril is kind of bad, although some people seem to think he's a little underappreciated. But a common trend in some of the modern games, or in most of the modern games, is that you train a character, that character is going to be viable, right? In Awakening, you can train anyone, and there are very few characters who are like borderline unplayable, even on the harder difficulties. Well, while in FE6, a big majority of the roster are just kind of very average, right? It's not that they're bad, it's not that they're unusable, they're just very average. And on the other side, you have these titans like Rutger, like Marcus, Alan, Lance, Percival. Like, you have these units that are just monsters that can like solo maps once they're properly trained. In Percival's case, he can solo maps at base. I think he can actually like beat the game with 0% growths on his own. I think he can, as long as he has enough weapons. That's how strong he is. So why are the units so unbalanced? Well, I think part of it has to do with the fact that back then, like, game balance wasn't really a thing. Like, I think that, you know, the developers of FE6 didn't really necessarily know what made a character strong. They knew a little bit, but they had some weird ideas, like archers being absolutely horrendous and armor knights being unplayable. But I also think they weren't as concerned with making units similar. A lot of the Redux patches and like remakes that we see pop up everywhere about FE6, they always do the same thing. They always try to like scale everyone up to around equal level, and I don't like that. I don't like that. I think part of the charm in FE6 is that units are on a different power level. There are some units who are just blatantly better than others, and I think because there are weak characters in that game, it really emphasizes how powerful the strong units are. When I play a game like Fates, everyone kind of feels equal. I know they're not. I know there are differences between those characters, but those differences feel a lot less significant when everyone can become good. In Awakening, like, can a character like Vake, who was an absolute beast in my Iron Man run, but like has been trash every other time I've played, simply because I chose to focus on him in my Iron Man run and just gave him a lot of levels, and as a result he became good. Can you really like say with certainty that Vake is good or bad? Because at the end of the day, like, anyone you train up in Awakening can become decent and clear out maps. Not so in FE6. I mean, you can try to give Volt a lot of kills, but Volt is never going to be a good unit regardless. The best you can really obtain with Volt is a unit that does good chip damage early on, and a unit that maybe kills one enemy and enemy phase after that. You can train Barth, and you get a pretty sturdy physical tank that can't really hit much, but like, he's not going to be able to solo maps regardless of how many stat boosters you feed him or how many arena kills you give him. He's just not going to be able to do that. And I think there is a realism to that. And I know realism in Fire Emblem not really what you want. Like, yeah, Pegasus Knights fly around in thigh highs. Like, yeah, realism is a bit of an iffy subject in FE6. But I still enjoy that there is some level of realism in terms of the power level of each unit. Some units are just more talented than others. Some units are stronger than others. And I think that adds a level of, again, realism to the game. And I also think it's enjoyable to figure out who is strong and who is weak. It adds more discussion. And also, you know, when you realize that some units may not be as weak as other people have led them to believe. Like, Mecha did a waifu on Cecilia, the pre-promoted Valkyrie that joins you around midway through the game. For years and years and years, everyone has been saying that, oh, she's so trash because her bases are really low. And then Mecha comes along and he makes this video with really convincing arguments saying that, you know what, she's actually pretty good if you actually give her a try. You don't get that in many other Fire Emblem games where all the units are good. You don't get that kind of interesting unit discussion and analysis. And that's why I kind of like the fact that Binding Blade's roster is very varied and very different in power level, because it just sparks more discussion, in my opinion. Like, no one's gonna argue that Rutger is bad. Like, everyone knows Rutger is like one of the best units in the game. That's okay. Like, that is pretty much established. But, you know, a character like Trek, for example, a character that a lot of people may not want to give a chance. Trek, in my opinion, is actually a very interesting unit in FE6, and a unit that can actually become pretty good, and he has some hidden qualities to him that may be a little bit underappreciated. Stuff like that is what you get when you have a roster that doesn't just power everyone up to the same level, and I think that honestly creates a more organic and interesting gameplay experience. Number 6. Supports are short, but they're still very good. So, a common complaint that I hear about FE6 supports is that they're kinda dull, and yeah, there are some who are pretty bad, but I actually think that there's a lot of really underappreciated supports. Again, I think that the initial translation patch that a lot of people played back in the day kinda did it a little bit of a disservice because it was just very basic in its language, so the supports came off as very bland. It's definitely a lot better in the new and improved one. But I think that despite not being very long, I think they convey a lot. There are some absolutely extraordinary supports in FE6, like Astor, or Astolfo as he's called in the new patch, and Igran. Absolutely heartbreaking support. It's so good. Like, if you haven't seen it, go watch my Igran Spotlight where I cover it. It almost made me cry the first time I read it. It's that good. You know, Trek's supports are absolutely hilarious. Gonzalez has some adorable supports that are just wonderful. And even some of Roy's supports are really good. I really like his support conversations with Shana, where he talks about depression, of all things, which is, you know, a strangely relatable topic for a lot of people watching. You know, it's Binding Blade has a lot of hidden gems in its supports, and I will say I'm not a big fan of how long it takes to build supports in that game. They are notoriously slow, although I do have my suspicions about why they're so slow. And I think it is because they don't want you to get all of them early on. FE6, I've already talked about how long it is, how long it takes to play the game. And I think one of the reasons why it takes so long to unlock the supports is because you're not really supposed to unlock them early on. You're supposed to get them slowly over the course of an entire playthrough. And you're not really supposed to reach the A levels until into the end game, and that's why I think they have these restrictions, like capping out how many you can get in a single map, and, you know, having them take so long to build. And yeah, I do agree it does suck a little bit because it means that a lot of people are not going to see them. Like, I think the first 2 or 3 times I played through Binding Blade, before I knew anything about Fire Emblem, I think I got the Roy Lilina support, and then one more, and that was it. I didn't get any support conversations. Now, I wasn't actively trying to get them, but I didn't really know where to go online to read up like what characters could support with who. I'm not a big fan of them leaving it hidden either, but the supports themselves are actually really good. They are really good. Another great one, go look up Igren and Sol. They have an amazing one where, you know, Sol actually makes some pretty convincing cases in like for religion, which is, you know, absolutely astonishing. Like it's the game has some gems, absolutely, and the supports are actually really good. And yeah, sure, they're not super long, but in my opinion, having long supports doesn't necessarily make them better. There's definitely a case of Fire Emblem often needing to say less with more, or saying more with less, I guess is the term that I'm looking for, because, you know, for example, take Tree Houses, where you just get lambasted with supports at every doorstep. You know, sometimes I feel like, you know, quantity is less important than quality, and in FA6 you definitely have a lot of quality, if you know where to look. Number 7, the game has some extremely well-designed maps. So, Fire Emblem 6's map design is not necessarily spectacular from start to finish. There are some pretty annoying maps, and it is kinda boring that every map is a seas. But I will say that among the bad maps, there are also a lot of really good ones, and a few good maps can really make or break a game. Just like Chapter 10 of Conquest is like one of the best games in the series and makes me want to play Conquests, there are some maps in FE6 that are so good that I look forward to them every time I'm about to play them. The first one is Chapter 7, where you fight against the Ostian revolts that takes place out in the city. It is a really hard map, but man is it fun. There's so much going on in that map, so many buildings to visit, so many enemies everywhere, so much you gotta be wary of, and on hard mode it just becomes a ridiculous challenge that you need to be at your A game to accomplish. I really like Chapter 11B, the Western Isles chapter where you get Echidna. My god, it is one of the best chapters in Fire Emblem overall. There's so much going on. So many houses to rescue, so many bonus objectives, green units you gotta try and keep alive, recruitable characters that are kind of hard to get unless you know how to properly position your characters. There's just so much happening in that map. And then you got chapters like Chapter 21 where you fight against all the Wyverns in Burn, and there's just so many of them, and holy crap. Yeah, you can trivialize it if you know how the reinforcement zones work, but if you try to play it regularly, man, you're gonna be killing a lot of Wyverns, and holy crap does it feel like an epic war. So FE6, while it may not always have spectacular map design, there are some real gems hidden in with the rest, and man are they fun to play. Number 8, you get a lot of characters right away. Now, one really underappreciated aspect of Fire Emblem 6 that I always like every time I play it is how quickly your army grows and how much choice you have in what units to field early on. In most of the other Fire Emblem games, you're stuck with this kind of like small army of scrubs for a majority of the early game. You know, in FE7 you have Lin mode, which arguably you don't really need to play if you know what you're doing. You can just get a save, but still, this might be something you need to track through. And in so many of the other games, you just have like 5 or 6 people for the first few maps. But in Fire Emblem 6, by the time you beat Chapter 3, you have an army of 14 playable characters. 13 if you don't count Merlinus, which arguably many people don't, so 13. Which is pretty insane. That means that, you know, by the time you hit battle preparations, you actually have a lot of choice in who you want to field. And this really makes the early game for me a lot more interesting, because, you know, I can actually start planning out my roster from a really early point, and a lot of the characters that you get early on are pretty viable too if you give them some experience. So, you know, there's a lot of choice in what army you want to field. And I also like that, you know, I just like having a big army. I like having a lot of soldiers on the field, and even though Binding Blade's early game has its own problems, at least you get a lot of units to play with, which makes it more interesting, as opposed to some other games where I feel like it's kind of boring early on, and I kind of like, I don't really care about it. I just want to get through it so I can get to the exciting part. Whereas Binding Blade, at least to me, is exciting from the very first map, and, you know, that makes the whole gameplay experience a lot better. Number 9. The game has a huge roster. Now, this ties a little bit into my previous point about you getting a lot of characters right away. You also just get a lot of characters, period, in this game. In total, this game has 54 playable characters. 53 if you don't count Merlinus, which arguably a lot of people don't, but that's still a lot of playable characters that you can have fun with. Now, there are other games in the series that have a bigger roster. I think Radiant Dawn has like 80 plus characters, and the Arcanea games have like 70 plus because of all the characters they shoehorned in their last minutes. But in Radiant Dawn, you don't really get to play with all of them because they come and go, and in the Arcanea games, a lot of them are just so generic, they're very forgettable. But in Fire Emblem 6, I feel like every character is interesting, at least in some ways. They have supports, they have some use. I have actually played Binding Blade so many times on my own that I have tried bringing everyone to the temple. And I mean every single character. I even had a playthrough where I brought Merlinus to the temple, because in order to get their best endings, you gotta take him to the temple and kill Idun, which is kind of funny. Like, I'm gonna talk more about that in my final point, the secret ending, but I actually really like how much diversity and choice you have. Now, yeah, a lot of people will counter this, but with, yeah, but like 70% of the roster are kind of bad, so you end up using the same people anyway. Yeah, that's true. Like, if you want to try hard and play well, then you'll feel like Alan, Lance, Rutger, Marcus, and then eventually you'll get Percival, maybe use Clarine as well, she's pretty good. And yeah, you just kind of end up using the same guys every single playthrough, but I don't know, I feel like that's not necessarily something that you need to do. Like, yeah, sure, if you want to build the very best army, you can use all the A+ tier characters, but there's also some merit in, you know, just using some of the more average ones. I had a playthrough where I specifically only used average units. I brought all the bad guys to the temple. I used Trek, I used Geese, I used Gareth, I used Yuno, I used, you know, all of these like very forgettable characters, and all of them performed relatively well, even on hard mode. They were not like these powerhouses like Rutger that can just like solo dragons on their own and just like kill entire armies like Percival do, but they were okay in their own right, and they were able to perform just fine. They needed a little bit of help, they needed to gang up a little bit, they couldn't necessarily like kill units on their own, but you know, they could work together and achieve relatively successful results. And you know, there's if you want to bring everyone to the temple, you gotta have to do a lot of playthroughs, and that again, to me, incentivizes replayability, which I think FE6 has a lot of. Number 10, the secret true ending is very fulfilling when you obtain it. So, as most of you watching probably know, if you want to reach the true ending of FE6, you need to unlock every single guidance chapter, get every single legendary weapon, and retain those legendary weapons until the time where you kill Sephiel. At that point, you will continue the game, you will go to the Dragon Temple, and you will defeat the real enemy behind it all. Now, gameplay design-wise, there are some issues with this, and I think Shane Brain, who does like retrospective of the games, he pointed this out, and he had some pretty good points about, yeah, it's a little bit of a flawed system because the game doesn't really tell you that this is what you're supposed to do. If you reach Sephiel and even one of the divine weapons is broken, then you lose out and the game ends right there, and you get sort of like a half-assed ending. This actually happened to me on my first playthrough of Binding Blade. I finally reached King Sephiel, I killed him, and I was like, is that it? That was the feeling I was left with. I was like, that's it? What these endings are so short. You know, you get these like very basic endings. It was like, went back to his home country, rebuilt his village, went home. Like, I was like, where are the good endings? Like, what's going on here? Like, what? I felt hollow after beating the game for the first time. And some people may say that's a bad thing, right? Because I was disappointed. I really was. I was like, but what about that Dark Priestess? You know, is the game just not going to mention her? Like, I thought maybe there was a game in between FE6 and FE7 that I didn't play that like expanded on this. And then I remember I saw a YouTube video of Roy fighting Idun, and I was like, what? I never saw that boss. How do you get that boss? And then I saw in the comment section, and a guy was like, yeah, you gotta do blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh. And I remember like booting up the game again on hard mode, and I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna get the good ending. And I actually failed to get the good ending on my second playthrough. I think I lost Gale, and so I didn't get the 21x, and I was so frustrated when I reached Sephiel, and I did it a third time, and then I actually managed to get the good ending, and I was so satisfied. Now, yeah, sure, it's not great design, but man, does it give you something to work towards. And man, like the feeling when I actually obtained it, it was so satisfying. I think that really cemented Binding Blade as one of my favorite games. The fact that I failed, and then I tried again, and I failed, and I tried a third time, and I succeeded it. That was an immense feeling of accomplishment that I had. And I think having the balls to hide your true ending behind guidance chapters, it is a risky move for sure. You do risk pissing off the player and like ruining some players' experience. But man, to those players who actually discover this and manage to get through it and do it properly, you really make real fans out of those people, I think. I really think you do that. I think that hand-holding and like being afraid to upset the player base by just serving them everything on a platter, you can't fail as long as you go through the chapters, you'll reach the true ending. I don't know, I'm a big fan of secret endings. I really am. I think they really add a lot to the game overall. And yeah, again, the system is not perfect. It sucks that you lose, like, Jarrett. You're not going to be able to unlock the Ilya chapter like I did in my Iron Man, and then you lose out on the best ending. But hey, I mean, in order to have something be worth something, you have to actually include a chance of failing. And even though that chance could be a little bit more transparent, I still think that it's a good thing that it's there. And again, I really like how the final roster of characters in Binding Blade that you bring to the Dragon Temple, you get those people's true endings. So, for example, if you want to know what happened to Aigren and Astolfo, you're going to have to bring, or possibly both of them into the Dragon Temple, and you'll get their true endings, which dictates that both of them vanish, which kind of hint at the fact that they kind of run off together, which is not something that you would ever experience unless you bring both of them to the Dragon Temple. And I think that it's a lot of it really incentivizes you to replay the game to get everyone's true ending, which I did, and I'm very glad I did, because again, it's just really, it feels like an accomplishment, and I really like that. And as a result, I am a big fan of FE6's true ending, even though I know from a design perspective that it could have been done better. I really like what it was going for, and I like what it did to me personally as a player. It gave me a level of fulfillment and accomplishment that I wouldn't be able to obtain in many other Fire Emblem games. And for that, it gets a big thumbs up for me. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of this video, the 10 reasons why I love Binding Blade. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I got it out a little bit late. I realized that depending on where you live in the world, it may be the day after, but hey, I figured better late than never. I've been wanting to make this video for a long while now, and I figured this was a good opportunity to do it. So what I'm interested in hearing right now is, what do you guys think about my 10 points, and what do you guys think about Binding Blade overall? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section, and you know, if this video inspired you to boot up a playthrough of FE6, then let me know about it and tell me what characters you intend to use, because I love that stuff, and I will try to reply to a few of those comments after releasing this video, and I'd love to have a little bit of a character discussion with you and talk about what characters are good and bad. That's always like one of my favorite things to do with FE6. Regarding FE6 content in the future, I am definitely going to be doing a remastered Let's Play with Mecha at some point, where I just play through the entire game with full voice-acted story and everything, kind of like how we're doing FE4 now, and yeah, just go through the entire game, because I still have not done the full translated, the new translation patch with voice acting, and I'm very interested in doing that, but that's going to be a little while. I think I want to do FE5 first, so we'll see about that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Give this video a like and a comment, and subscribe for more Fire Emblem content. My name is Manx, and happy birthday, Binding Blade.